Humankind game released on the 17th of August 2021, a few months ago at the time of recording this video, and I've seen a lot of commentary on social media, in my emails and inboxes, and indeed many, dare I say, slightly clickbaity or perhaps view-hungry videos on YouTube, maybe this one isn't too dissimilar, talking about the decline in Humankind's player base. We all know Humankind to be a pretty good 4X historical strategy game, not too dissimilar from the likes of Civilization 5 or Sid Meier's Civilization 6. We also know that it has seen a decline in players, and the numbers are very clear. From launch, depending on who you listen to and who's reported it, the data suggests, or at least the data that we have, suggests that Humankind has lost somewhere between 60 and 80% of players if you look at purely the numbers from launch day compared to the rolling daily average over the last few weeks. Okay, that is the fact. There is no denying it, and whether you think my opinions are influenced or not, they're not, by the way, but even if you think they are, you can't argue with that fact. What I would like to discuss in this video, and I'd like to discuss with you a little more detail in the comments or in future live streams, is why. Why is Humankind's player base declining? What can we take from these numbers? What can we compare it to? For example, how did Civilization 6 fare when it launched? What are the factors that are in favor of Humankind's declining player base? That is to say, what makes it normal, predictable, understandable? What are other things we can use to sort of justify or explain it? And then the counter. What are the things that are going against Humankind's favor? What are some things that could be turning players away? And then finally, an interesting point around more broader competition within the sector. My name is JumboPixel. Get comfortable and enjoy this gameplay, which is a continuation on from yesterday's video, so if you saw that, this will be familiar to you. It's spicy and I hope you enjoy. Anyway, Humankind has seen a decline in its player base, and I'd like to start with the negatives. What are things that could have pushed players away from Humankind? How can we explain this in a way that sympathizes with people leaving the game? I think there are broadly three key points. Firstly, it does suggest maybe there are some failings or less interest in Humankind from launch, right? That's the most obvious explanation, I think, on this side of the fence. Players are not playing this game as much. Why? Because they do not think it is in a state where they can enjoy it. For me personally, by the way, just so you know, it obviously totally is. I love it. But my experience is not everyone's. There could be difference out there, and I respect that. Secondly, balance. The media, and indeed, has talked about this, cited this as the reason why players aren't sticking around in Humankind. It's at least a balanced experience. With 1.6 million combinations of cultures, I've said for months and months and months, and copped a lot of flack for saying it sometimes, that you should expect that. Right? It's not going to be a, quote, perfectly balanced game. There's just too much variety. It's never going to be perfect, is my opinion. But I respect it, and there is definitely work to be done, and the developers have acknowledged that coming out in future Humankind patches and updates. So I will park that idea there for the minute. Lastly, I think also there's some ideas around stability, sort of tacking on to the end of that other point around balance. Some people are finding the game to be unstable, or they're frustrated with glitches and bugs and so on. Again, that goes in the same basket as that previous point. And one other final one, maybe also we should expect a certain sensationalism when games launch. And actually that ties me through into the second part of this video, what I'm calling the positives. How can we explain this decline in player count in a way that is more rational? It's not dogging on Humankind for being a bad, broken experience, which is some people's opinion, and that's totally fine, but instead, how can we explain this in other ways? And I have a few ideas that I'll touch on, just like I touched on those negative points. Firstly, it's a new game and it's a new IP. When new games launch, they see more players than they keep. This is just the human experience. Like any new song, new film, new flavor of ice cream, or new drink to try, lots of people will try it, But not all of those people will decide to continue consuming or using it for the rest of their lives. That's a natural part of the human experience. And then couple that with the fact that this is a new IP, a new intellectual property, a new franchise. And I think you maybe see that potentially to an even more extreme point, right? This is not Humankind 5 coming out after Humankind 4 before Humankind 6. This is not a well-established series. It does not have a well-established following to move into it from a previous title. And that probably makes it a bit more difficult. Yes, Amplitude have done things before, but nothing like Humankind. The settings have been entirely different. Next up, I would say that a lot of the statistics that we're using are Steam statistics. And the thing about numbers, and this is a broader point for another video, but the thing about numbers is that you can kind of sway data anyway, right? The numbers don't lie, but the people behind it do. The sources do. They're not necessarily through ill intent. It could just be the fact that they can't see everything, or cover everything, or hear everything. And there's probably an element of that here too. Most of the time I think we use Steam data, which is by and large probably the best way to report on most games, absolutely. And Humankind is no different. But it's important to note that there is also a Game Pass version. Game Pass for PC. Lots of people who I've spoken to are playing Humankind on Game Pass to PC. Relative to the number of people on Steam, probably still quite small, but it's important to note. Likewise, Google Stadia, and of course the Mac version hasn't launched either. So I think there are some niche player bases, maybe 5% in each one, maybe 10. I don't know the numbers. We don't know the numbers. But there's definitely a group of people who aren't being included in those statistics. Something to bear in mind. Next up, it is of course launching around a tricky holiday period, Techtober, so there's potentially lots of interest in the market. I'll cover that in my interesting section toward the end of the video. Lastly, and it's important to note that a boom and bust cycle is totally normal. Earlier in the video I touched on the fact that when games launch, they have more interest than the rest of their lives. And we saw this with Civilization as well. I mean, take a look at the data here. It's very clear. When Civilization 6 launched, it had roughly 66% more players than it did 2 months following. The same time period of data that we're looking at Humankind. It's not as extreme of a drop, but it's still 2/3. I mean, this is roughly within ballpark, especially when you take those other considerations that I've already discussed into account. Finally, I'd like to talk about more of a point of interest than a yes or no, and then I'll move through into my concluding thoughts for this video. My point under my interesting section is broadly around competition. I wonder, is Humankind launching in a time period where it had its best shot to succeed, its worst shot to succeed, or somewhere in between? And I'm honestly not quite sure. I mentioned in a video a couple of weeks ago that as strategy gamers, we are in a glorious time to be strategy gamers, to be people who like to play games involving geography or history or policy and political decisions. However you want to frame it, this is a good time for us. For me personally, the franchises that I might reach out to would be Humankind, Civilization, Old World, Stellaris, Crusader Kings, Hearts of Iron, Europa Universalis, Total War. The list goes on, and it's an ever-increasing, wonderful list. Before we even look at areas on the fringe, like city-building games and other management games, right? We do live in a glorious age where we have so much variety and so many effective, well-crafted, cared-for projects, right? We definitely do. And I wonder what impact that had on Humankind's launch. It didn't launch at the same time as Civilization 7, and that has to be in its favour. But as I covered earlier, it launched in a slightly more difficult part of the year, not its intended time that it wanted to launch either. Maybe pays to bear that in mind. And I wonder what impact that has more broadly on it. It's a point to note, and something that maybe we should discuss in a future video. To conclude here, I want to stress two things. Firstly, Humankind's player count has declined. Like most other new games, it's very rare to have a new game that doesn't see a decline in viewership. But just like, and I'm going to argue really any other game, Civilization 6, a great example of this too, we should expect boom and bust cycles, and I wouldn't run away in fear. Indeed, I'm not going to. You can choose to, that's totally fine. But I'm not going anywhere because I enjoy the Humankind experience, and I think that in general, games do see a decline in players, but as I mentioned, there's a boom and bust cycle here. When updates come out, we see player counts surge. When DLC comes out, we see player counts surge. Just like anything in a highly competitive, highly busy, highly productive modern world, we find time for different things, and it tends to be boom and bust cycles. Thank you very much for joining me today for this video discussing Humankind's player count, and more broadly, the reasons that could be pro or against it, and Humankind's future development. If you enjoyed the video, do stick around, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, and bye-bye.